Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. I am your host, MagMongoSlade. Today, we're going to talk about NXT No Mercy from September the 1st, 2024. We're also going to be talking about Dave Meltzer and his comments on NXT Europe, which I believe we'll put after the show. Let's talk about that after the show because the show was fun. I want to talk about the show. Throughout the show, of course, there was some stuff that happened on TNA's pay-per-view that was important to NXT, so we'll talk about that. I did watch the TNA show, but it was so bad and it was so boring that I decided to not do a review because it was a waste of my time. But I will mention it here. I did watch the TNA show, and outside of maybe one match, I really didn't care about it. So we'll start with the main event on NXT because this actually matters. Ethan Page defeated Joe Hendry to retain the NXT Championship. The match was what it was. It wasn't great. It wasn't terrible. It was just kind of there. Joe Hendry is beloved by the audience. He's really over. So the crowd was definitely into it. But it wasn't the best match in the world. It's not exactly what the AEW fans thought it would be, but it wasn't far off. You know, the AEW fans had pretty much led everybody to believe this match was going to be terrible, that it was going to suck, that it was worthy of AEW Dark and not worthy of NXT, all this kind of stuff. I wouldn't say all of that, but it felt like a TNA mid-card match. That's what it felt like. Throughout the night, Trick Williams was trying to get these guys to understand that he's the authority and he's going to play by the rules and he's going to do everything fair. And for the most part, he did. He spent the early part of the match just establishing Trick Williams as the authority in the match, him breaking them up and yelling at them individually. And I really don't need that from the special guest referee, because we got a lot of that when Seth Rollins was a special guest referee. There was a lot of Rollins involvement to, I guess, keep things interesting, and that's the whole point of Trick Williams being here, is to keep things interesting. So there was a bulldog on the floor by Joe Hendry that was pretty cool. Ethan Page did a Ego's Edge, which is his version of the Razor's Edge on the ring apron. Joe Hendry was arguing with Trick Williams about Ethan Page's foot being on the ropes after he hit his finish. This led to Ethan Page knocking Joe Hendry into Trick Williams and knocked him outside of the ring. Another referee came in almost immediately at this point. But Trick Williams ended up knocking that referee out, I think, as Ethan Page was about to win. Ethan Page then hits the Ego's Edge on Joe Hendry for the 1-2-3. And despite the fact that the crowd was chanting, "Put on some clothes" for Ethan Page, which is based off, of course, the song that Joe Hendry was singing at him, it was a relatively clean finish. So Joe Hendry lost the match, which was not a surprise. After the match, Pete Dunne attacked Trick Williams, and this is going to lead to their match next week. Well, this coming Tuesday on NXT. Which is all well and good. Now, I didn't see this for myself clearly, but I heard that TNA taped their show on Saturday, excuse me. And during the tapings, they did a scene where Joe Hendry blames Josh Alexander for him not being the champion, which led to a lot of people thinking, okay, Josh Alexander is going to interfere in this match. That led me to believe that anyway. So maybe it was a red herring and they had to fill time with something. But I don't expect them to use that scene. So they'll probably have to edit it out. But maybe that was the proposed finish, that Joe Hendry would lose due to Josh Alexander. But that didn't seem to be the direction that they were going in. So this is one of those things where maybe what NXT had planned is affected by what TNA did a couple of days before, or at least one day before. But it also seems to me that clearly Joe Hendry was not going to show up on TNA's taping with the NXT title and spoil this match. So it tells me that despite the fact that was floating around out there, they had planned to maybe tape something else in between. So Joe Hendry lost. Ethan Page continues his run as champion, much to my chagrin, and we get Joe Hendry. I guess I don't think he's going to be gone, but maybe he's going to get a rematch or something. But this was fine. It was just a big old bowl of meh, but the crowd was into it, very into it, so that was fine. Now, this is going to surprise a lot of people, but to me, this was probably, maybe it was the second best match of the night, but in the moment, I was saying it was the best match of the night. Roxanne Perez defeats Jada Parker. Jada Parker has come along so well. And, you know, she actually sold a lot in this match. She showed a lot more fire and perseverance than she's ever shown before. She was really good here. And Roxanne Perez did a great job of carrying her because she's been in the business less than a year, Jada Parker. And so a lot of this was Roxanne Perez doing good work. So you got to give the young girl a lot of credit. We all know that I love me some Jada Parker. That girl fine. That girl bottom heavy too. Like the bottom half of her body is bigger than Roxanne Perez and has more charisma. Roxanne Perez is very tiny. She's incredibly tiny. She knows what she's doing. She's very young. They say she's 22. I thought she was a little bit older than that. I thought she was at least 24. But she's incredibly young. But she's got a lot going for her in terms of in the ring. And this in-ring story that they decided to tell was good. Jada Parker came into the match with a rib injury. So Roxanne Perez did a surfboard and kicked her into the steps, which, you know, jammed her ribs into the steps. And then she followed with various submission holds and, you know, attacks on the rib cage. Roxanne Perez actually did some stuff where she was mocking Jada Parker in terms of like doing her little butt smash she does in the corner and mocked her dance and all this kind of stuff. It was fun. Roxanne Perez, instead of going for her usual finisher, which is she went for a Rings of Saturn, which is, you know, the stretching of the rib cage, and she was elbowing in the ribs. And I thought, like, okay, that'd have been a good finish. But they took it to the next level by having Jada Parker actually power out of it. And that was Jada Parker's position in this match, is that she was the stronger girl. So they had her work a power-based move set, which, you know, was her catching Roxanne Perez as she jumped off the ropes and power bombs and stuff like that. So it was very cool. Eventually, Jada Parker did hit her finisher, which is the hypnotic, and Roxanne Perez fell out of the ring. Jada Parker immediately goes out there to do another one, but she was being duped by Roxanne Perez, and Jada Parker crashed through the barricade. Immediately followed by Pop Rocks on the floor. She was thrown into the ring, Pop Rocks again, and was pinned 1, 2, 3. So Jada Parker put up a really good fight. This match was very fun. As far as I'm concerned, I thought it was a very fun match. Roxanne Perez wins the match. I'm hideously biased towards Jada Parker. I'm not even going to lie to you. But she has the potential to be one of the best in the business in a couple of years. She's still very green. But in terms of charisma and personality and trying to put it all together, once she gets everything together, she's going to be great. She's going to be great. Roxanne Perez is already very good. The only problem is she's very tiny and her offense doesn't look believable. That's just the nature of women in WWE right now, is that she's so tiny and her offense is unbelievable. So after the match, we got the debut of Julia, the stare down between Roxanne Perez and Julia. A lot of people said this should have closed the show, which, you know, is probably true. It probably should have closed the show. But at the same time, I'm not sure that Julia is that well known in the United States. And this was big for people who are more familiar with her. So I'm thinking this is fine. Now, people did bring up an interesting question about Delta and Stephanie Vacher in terms of, you know, you can't have all of these women coming in at the same time because they're going to step on each other. So should one of these women go straight to the main roster? And I think, well, you got another place for them. You know, NXT has 2 singles women's championships. So you're likely to have another one of them go to the NXT North American title division. And then maybe you could have one of them go to the main roster. who I would like to put with Liv Morgan, and that being Delta. Now, the reason why I think Delta would work as Liv Morgan's heavy is because from the videos that I've seen of her, she's a bigger girl. Also, Rhea Ripley knows who she is because she's also from Australia. So they probably have some kind of history between the two of them, or Rhea Ripley could just help her come along. So Delta as the heavy for Liv Morgan could actually be pretty cool. And Stephanie Vacker, you could put her in the North American title division because I think she needs help with her English. So we got some time. Delta speaks English. She's Australian. So that could be a good way of spreading all of these women out and not having them all in NXT at one time, stepping on each other in terms of debuts and things like that. But Julia versus Roxanne Perez, they've been teasing this match for 3 months. So they're finally going to get to the point where the match is going to happen at some point in the future, probably at Halloween Havoc. Match number 4. Obafemi defeats Tony D'Angelo to retain the North American title. This match was good. It was hampered a little bit by Tony D'Angelo rolling his ankle or twisting his knee, whichever one it was. In about the mid part of the match, Tony D'Angelo was, basically on one leg for part of the match, and it suffered because of that. But I thought maybe they would end it at that point, but Tony D'Angelo worked through it. Eventually, they got back on track, and Tony D'Angelo and Obafemi had a pretty good match. Tony D'Angelo actually hit his finisher, the Forget About It, which is a fisherman suplex, and Obafemi kicked out of it. Tony D'Angelo actually kicked out of Obafemi's pop-up powerbomb, too. At one point, Obafemi went outside of the ring and just started kicking the ass of Luca Crucifino and Stacks and just throwing them around and everything, which was great, before beating Tony D'Angelo with a sit-out powerbomb. I certainly think they can do better. Obviously, the perceived injury of Tony D'Angelo slowed the match up a little bit, but it was still a fun match, and the crowd was still into it. It just took a little bit more because people were concerned and because the match slowed down a lot in the middle. It took some doing to get people back into it, but eventually they did, and Tony D'Angelo put up a pretty good fight. I expect a rematch of some sort because I can see that Tony D'Angelo is likely going to be the guy that's going to beat Obafemi in the future, because I don't really see them bringing in anybody unless they bring somebody from the main roster, or I don't really see it, or they do what I suggested, and that's the Obafemi beat Ethan Page for the title. But I would think that they would put that belt back on Trick first. So I don't know. But Obafemi is dominant. He looked great. Tony D'Angelo looked good too, with the exception of that injury. I just feel like the match suffered a little bit from the injury spot, and it slowed the match up considerably. The match number 3, Kalani Jordan versus Wendy Choo, was better than it had any right to be. The problem here is the match had no heat. There was some build for this match, but the match had no heat. Also, the match probably went a little longer than it should have, as the two girls seemed to get blown up somewhere near the end, which led to things getting a little bit sloppy. But the technical work between the two early, was pretty good. This was actually a cool down match because the first 2 matches were pretty hot. So this was kind of a good cool down match. So there was no problems, like no major issues. But Kalani Jordan, she's another one that has tremendous upside and tremendous potential. Her offense is very creative. She did a tornado DDT into an impaler DDT, which was pretty good. The issue here is that it was kind of slow, which is due to Kalani Jordan not having, the confidence or the experience to make her stuff look solid. Like, yes, there's a lot of choreographed offense for Kalani Jordan where you have to be in exact position for her to do stuff correctly. Once she's able to smooth all of that out, and it'll work a lot better. But a lot of her stuff looks good and is very impressive. Wendy Choo was the ring general here, having a little bit more experience than Kalani Jordan. I'm not sure Kalani Jordan been in the business 2 years, probably about 2, if that. And so Wendy Choo did a good job of carrying her through the match. Booker T called her the Sleepy Psycho, which I thought was fun. We still didn't get no explanation to why Wendy Choo is a heel now, except they decided to do that. So they did a false finish with the Wendy Choo sleeper hold. which was, it's always a trick for them to get these things on. But eventually she did get it on Kalani Jordan, and they did the old arm drop thing, and Kalani's wrist like nearly hit the mat, and then she powered out of it, which I thought was pretty cool, because I thought the match was over. And Kalani Jordan wins with the 450, followed up by a split leg moonsault, which is like, a choke slam and a tombstone, which, like, man, the 450 is a finisher on its own, isn't it? So, and then also Wendy Choo had to put herself in position for the split leg moonsault. But again, that's another one of those things where once Kalani Jordan gets used to doing her stuff, and it's also the nature of modern wrestling where people are putting themselves in position for moves by rolling hither and thither to get in position. So Kalani Jordan wins. Right decision. After the match, Tatum Paxley snuck up behind Wendy Choo and choked her out, and then put a Wendy Choo doll on the black pillow. So they're going to continue this Tatum Paxley Wendy Choo thing that is completely and totally unexplained outside of they don't want to be friends with each other. So they're going to fight. I don't understand what either one of these characters is about, but maybe they need to take some time to flesh things out a little bit. But Kalani Jordan, very good. I appreciate that. All right. The match number 2 is probably the match of the night. If you don't, well, it was one of the 3 options for match of the night. Zachary Wentz actually defeats Wes Lee with the UFO. So Zachary Wentz actually won the X Division Championship Friday night at Emergence in Ultimate X match, which featured Riley Osborne of Chase University. The match was fun, which, the Ultimate X is usually a pretty fun match. I was surprised to see Zachary Wentz win because I figured he would lose here. But once he won, of course, the question came out, okay, did they put the X Division title on him just for him to lose 2 days later on NXT? And then I figured, okay, if they do that, then he's in the same situation Jordan Grace was in, which is that he came over to NXT just to have the belt so people could see it. But instead, NXT seemingly did them the favor of putting Zachary Wentz over, which is what I suggested in the first place. I suggested that Zachary Wentz should have won this match, and he did win. And this match was very good. There was a lot of physical strikes. They actually threw punches, no shitty forearms, which was great. A lot of choreographed offense at the beginning, so it was kind of choppy, as they know each other, but it looked like they haven't wrestled each other in a while. So there was some missed spots here and there. But I loved this match. At one point, Wesley puts Zachary Wentz on the table, and the table just collapses underneath them. I mean, all he did was lay on the table. I'm talking about Zachary Wentz, and the table just collapsed. So Wesley obviously just goes over there and tells him not to move. He goes up and does a Swerve Strickland's double stomp from the top rope onto Zachary Wentz. But that wasn't enough to win. So later on, outside the ring, Wesley is frustrated. He grabs a chair. He goes to use the chair, but Trey Miguel snatches the chair from Trey Miguel is in the crowd. He grabs the chair, snatches it away from him. When Wesley turns around, he is distracted by Trey Miguel. And then when he turns back around, he gets caught in a Canadian destroyer by Zachary Wentz. Zachary Wentz throws him back into the ring and hits the UFO, which is a very top rope cutter, to win the match. And it was supposed to be like this big emotional victory for Zachary Wentz, redemption, which is what the X Division title was all about. Because he had cut a promo on Emergence after he won the X Division title, saying that a lot of people gave up on him, how he kind of gave up on himself after he was fired from WWE, and he worked hard to get back in position, worked hard to get back where he was, only to, be kind of overlooked. And winning the X Division title was redemption, and this is sort of redemption too. Is that Zachary Wentz is back. He's in a great position now. A lot of people, said, had these questions about, Speedball Mike Bailey winning the TNA X Division title. He beat Mustafa Ali about a month ago, and he's already lost it to Zachary Wentz. And people was like, what the hell was the point? And I was thinking, yeah, that is kind of a good point. Like, Mike Bailey has been the X Division champion twice. I think grand total of 30 days a piece, maybe. You know, like he has never been champion that long. But it was probably the right decision by TNA to put the belt on Zachary Wentz because the guy ended up putting on one of the best matches on NXT in a really hot feud. And he's going to stick around in NXT for a little while as Wentz and Trey challenged Fraxium for the tag team titles. And they're going to get put in a triple threat match instead for the number one contendership because Ava just can't think, apparently. So Zachary Wentz and Trey Miguel are going to be around for a little bit longer. I'm thinking, and perhaps this will be the case, maybe Wesley will beat him for that title. The X Division belt, I'm saying. Maybe that's what they're going to go for. I don't think this feud is over, personally. I think the Wesley Zachary Wentz match was very good. I think that Wesley losing was the right decision. But they're going to book it like it was a 2-on-1 because Trey Miguel saved Zachary Wentz. So maybe they're going to run it back at Halloween Havoc, or maybe they'll run it back at one of these TNA pay-per-views and put the X Division title on the line. And I would love that. And I think that would make why Mike Bailey lost. It would make it worth it if you could get the X Division title on NXT pretty regularly. And it will actually give Wesley something to do while the title picture, I'm talking about the mainline NXT title, is already taken care of. There has been a lot of debate and issue about Scott D'Amore doing this interview with Chris Van Vliet, where he believes that AEW did more for TNA than WWE is doing. And that was based off of Kenny Omega being the guy that came over to AEW. And I don't have it all written down in front of me, but I think the bulk of it was Kenny Omega gave them their biggest buy rate in terms of pay-per-view during the pandemic. And the TV ratings were up higher when they were doing the crossover with AEW, which no doubt probably has some element of truth to it. At the time, AEW was incredibly hot, and everything that they were involved with, people were pretending to be very interested in. At the same time, though, you had Chris Jericho come out in public and say he will never go work in TNA. You had Sammy Guevara refused to work in TNA. You had, and he was actually sent home by TNA because he was refusing to do the creative that was pitched by TNA. You had Tony Khan that was on TNA weekly, dissing the show, dissing the product, dissing the wrestlers, all kinds of stuff. You had Matt Hardy and Private Party who were on the show, but they weren't doing much of anything, and it didn't really help them at all. And also, sometimes, occasionally, I know he had an excuse for this, but Kenny Omega didn't draw anything on television for TNA. His, I think, initial run did well, but there's also, you can look, and this was at different times. I know that he claimed that the highest rated episode of TNA in the last decade or something like that was featured Kenny Omega, but it was also one of the lowest with featured Kenny Omega, and he tried to use an excuse and all that. Like, nah. Omega was a star at the time. He was on national television. AEW was hot. They were selling out arenas, and nobody was watching TNA, because to see Kenny Omega. They didn't really care. And it is also on the part of that a lot of the talent who were there were frustrated because they couldn't get on AEW television. So it was basically low-level guys from AEW were coming on to TNA show, beating their guys or whatever, and that was it. There was no reverse. I know Deonna Purrazzo was one of the people who was very frustrated, and Jordan Grace was another one that was very frustrated by the lack of women being able to cross over and go onto AEW TV, and they weren't doing it. They weren't even letting any guys go over on AEW television. I think the Good Brothers were the only ones, and they were, of course, friends with the Elite, so they're the only ones who got to do the crossover stuff. I don't remember any other solo act or any other tag team or anything like that working an AEW show while they were under TNA contract. Maybe it was somebody else, but I don't remember it. So there was a lot of frustration, but that frustration doesn't exist here. The According to Anthem, there has been some improvement on their memberships in terms of their streaming service since they started working with NXT. There's also had more sellouts in terms of buildings since they started working with NXT. And the talent seems to be happier and with working with NXT than they were with working with AEW. So I know that, you know, Scott D'Amore is a guy who is he's Canadian, so he's always gonna root for guys like Kenny Omega, and he wasn't deeply involved with the AEW thing. He hasn't been that involved with the TNA thing, even though he knew it was going to happen, and even though he was the one who pitched it, the crossover with WWE, he actually pitched it. And he was the one who okayed Jordan Grace going over for the Royal Rumble, and for Mickie James to go over to the Royal Rumble. So he was he had begun the process. So it's not like he's against WWE, but he basically was saying that he felt that AEW did more because they had top level mainline stars come over versus WWE, which is limiting the crossover to NXT only. But NXT seems to be happy with the deal, and TNA wrestlers seem to be happy with the deal. So, I don't know, maybe Scott D'Amore has just biased for Kenny Omega. There's also some interesting bits for the TNA tapings. Carmen Petrovich is going to be on TNA, and Ariana Grace is going to be on TNA. Now, the interesting bit here is, of course, she is Santino Marella's daughter, and I'm interested, very, very interested, in seeing how they're going to do Santino or Ariana working together, because she's not using the name. So are they going to acknowledge at all that Santino is her father? And if so, how is that going to play out on NXT? Because I definitely think that Santino, he was in Ohio Valley, so he wasn't, but he could actually come over to NXT, and that could be fun. You know, Santino is a well-known WWF character. Even the name is well-known. Could you have Santino work on NXT, in his daughter's corner, or in some way acknowledging her or trying to get her to sign with TNA or something? You could do something fun with that, but I want to see how they're going to do it. So I'm very interested in Ariana Grace being on TNA just because I know Santino is there. Now, the tag team championship match opened the show. Axiom and Nathan Frazer defeated Chase University. So Chase University were only tag team champions for like 2 weeks, which, I was kind of like, why? But then, of course, once you get to the end, you realize why. This was also a very good match. Tremendous opening contest. They had a really good match a couple of weeks ago, too. So it was not really that much of a surprise that it was still very good. Nathan Frazer, they kept doing these miscommunications between Nathan Frazer and Axiom, where Nathan Frazer would hit the ropes while Axiom is on them, and he would get crotched. And then Axiom would try to go for his Axiom kick or whatever he calls it, and he ended up hitting Nathan Frazer. So they were telling the story that Axiom and Nathan Frazer were miscommunicating, and they weren't on the ball, which is a story they've been telling for weeks with Axiom and Nathan Frazer, that these guys have been distracted by their solo careers and not really focused on being tag team champions. And yet, they ended up winning the match. So after Axiom and Nathan Frazer won, Chase University did like a big huddle at the end where everybody was sad about the loss. Specifically, Andre Chase was the one who was pinned. It was a Spanish fly followed by a Phoenix Splash by Nathan Frazer to win the match. And Ridge Holland snaps and beat up everybody in Chase University. He snapped and beat them all up, except Thea Hale, of course. She's outside crying and carrying on, and and Ridge Holland is trying to put these guys in the dirt. Like, he was the one who initially he slammed Andre Chase on the table and it didn't break. So that's why the table broke later when Zachary Wentz laid on it. But Ridge Holland rules, man. Like, he crushed the buildings on these guys. Like, he really beat the shit out of these dudes. And Thea Hale was very upset, So in the margins of my notes, I wrote down it was a good match, but why did Axiom and Nathan Fraser win? And then once Ridge Holland started kicking the ass of Chase University, I wrote, this is why, and this rules. So Ridge Holland is back to being a heel. All the stuff that he said about Thea Hale reminded him of himself, and Thea Hale believing in him. All this has been shredded. I got to tell you, the Chase University story, again, it's been going on since 2020, I think. And it continues to create great content for NXT. There has been no misses when it comes to Chase University and the storyline that involves these guys. And you would ask the question, like, how long can Thea Hale be in Chase University? She's been in Chase University the entire time she's been there. You know, and Andre Chase became Chase University, I think, in 2020 or maybe 2021. So it's been a solid 3 years. And no doubt how many times they have teased various members leaving Chase University or people coming in. It has worked every single time. You know, it worked when JC Jane left the group, and it worked here when Ridge Holland was leaving the group. And it actually, of course, validates Riley Osborne and Duke Hudson, who didn't trust Ridge Holland in the first place. And Ridge Holland, the rage monster that he is very frustrated. It took him 6 years to win a title in NXT. He finally won it, only to have Andre Chase lose it for him. So he's pissed. This is going to be great going forward. So this is going to be fun. You know, Axiom and Nathan Fraser, I don't really care about them. You know, neither one of them is really all that interesting. They don't really have much of a personality. They don't have a tag team name or anything. But they're going to tease that they're going to wrestle the Rascals. So that ought to be fun. Hopefully the Rascals just beat Gallus and Hank and Tank in that triple threat match, and we can just focus on Axiom and Nathan Fraser versus the Rascals. That could be fun. So maybe I'll do that at TNA pay-per-view. I don't know, but we'll see. All in all, though, NXT No Mercy from top to bottom was a really good show. They actually had angles, which Bash in Berlin did not. So this is, once again, I will say I enjoyed this show more than the mainline WWE show. More emotional matches. Zachary Wentz and Wesley was amazing. There was a little bit of a letdown with Obafemi and Tony D'Angelo because of Tony D'Angelo's injury. And the main event was meh. Huge meh. So maybe in terms of in-ring, you probably would prefer Bash in Berlin. But in terms of storyline and match, No Mercy is a much better show. But, you know, that depends on the way you choose to grade the events. I personally like No Mercy a lot better. So let's talk about Meltzer and NXT Europe real quick. And then this is ridiculous. Now, Meltzer at one point on Wrestling Observer Radio or whatever made the following statements. I just keep thinking, like, remember when they closed NXT UK? This was a couple of years ago now, and they were going to immediately reopen NXT Europe, and then they fired almost everyone. Most of the people that worked NXT UK were fired. And I thought if you were going to NXT Europe, like, you say, why are you firing people? They were under $25,000 a year contracts. It's not like they were paying giant money to these people. The cost savings were negligible. Other people were telling me they're never going to do this Europe thing. They say it because they didn't want to admit to shutting down the UK thing, because the UK thing was their original idea to offset that ITV show. I'm guessing he means the World of Sport show that's supposed to start up. I always hear we're doing the European thing, but it's been years now, and I'm hearing less now than I heard years ago that they are. Maybe someday we'll hear about it, but now there's new ownership. Maybe they're not going to be down with that. Okay, he answered his own question at the end, but this is not good information, right? Let's put it like that. He's basically saying, well, didn't they say they were going to do the NXT Europe and now they're not doing it? It's like, well, yeah, they sold the company since then. So that's an obvious situation that when they told you they were going to do NXT Europe, the company was owned by the McMahons. Now the company is not owned by the McMahons anymore. So people are going to have different ideas. So that part is pretty obvious. But there was a lot of commotion about this. You know, people talking about, oh, how these European indies, they sold out. Most of them were only being paid $16,000, $25,000. This is minimum wage. blah blah blah. This continued on with the Swerve Strickland, wrestler pay argument. But there's a huge thing that only some people mentioned, but even they didn't go far enough. For instance, they say, oh, NXT UK, the only point of it was to kill the European indies, which is not true because, most of them were like, look, Rev Pro, which is the company that Will Ospreay was working for a long time. They were the only ones who didn't work with WWE, and they're doing great. And it's like, well, all the companies that worked with WWE, all of them are fine. They still operate, they still make money. I think they're probably on a lower tier than they were before, but there was a worldwide pandemic in 2020, right? So that's two things. For starters, the company was sold. Secondly, there was a worldwide pandemic in 2020, which led to a lot of these companies taking financial hits. Now, the financial hits that these companies took, a lot of them were able to offset because they had WWE contracts. So like WXW had a WWF contract. ICW had a WWF contract, Progress. So they were able to run shows at least and get paid some money for it. And these shows were mostly empty arena. And they could at least get some money for it because they were being hosted by the WWE network. So those companies all still exist. You talk to some of these quote unquote Brit wrestling fans and they act like these companies are gone. They're not. They still exist. None of them are closed. So Rev Pro, I guess, ended up being the biggest one mostly because Will Ospreay worked there, and AEW was sending a lot of talent over there. But the big issue, of course, is speaking out, which a lot of damage was done to these brands due to speaking out, which some fans have mentioned. But they didn't go to the next level. And the next level is that the British government actually started investigating pro wrestling right after speaking out. And afterwards, they started putting together some kind of protection platform or something to that effect at the time. Now, you could look up the young lady who is Welsh, who is leading this organization. Her name is Alex Davies Jones. She's from a place called Pontypridd, which is in Wales. And she was a parliamentarian. I don't know if she still is or not. Again, I don't know anything about British, Parliament. But they did an investigation. They took them like a year or two. That was sparked by the speaking out situation, and they did a really thorough government investigation into pro wrestling in Britain, and they came out with a couple of things that probably led WWE to make the decision that this is not worth it. One is that they considered wrestling a sport. This is from her website. This is Alex Davies Jones. One of her recommendations says, quote, wrestling has fallen between the categories of sport and theater, sometimes categorized as sports entertainment. The panel recommends that wrestling training schools be considered as sporting and shows, promotions, and associated activity be considered theatrical or artistic or performative in respect of future guidance, legislation, and regulation. In other words, the training facilities where a lot of these kids were where like somebody like Marty Scurll was, having sex with 16-year-old girls, they wanted to consider those sporting facilities because they're training facilities, while the shows themselves would be art and theater. This, of course, flies in the face of what Vince McMahon argued in the 80s and 90s, is that all of pro wrestling, not just the training, is entertainment and should not be considered a sport. So this is kind of flies in the face of that. They started talking about minimum health and safety standards, which is not really a surprise. They want fitness forms, guidance, and all other sorts of minimum first aid training for all kinds of people involved. But this is the big one here. It says, quote, the wrestling industry suffers from a lack of official representation, and the report recommends the establishment of trade bodies to more effectively promote British wrestling. They're suggesting a union. That's a major... I don't know if this thing has existed yet. Again, I don't follow British wrestling that closely, so maybe it hasn't happened. But this was a recommendation by parliamentarians in the UK that they start a British wrestling union. WWE does not want to be bothered with unions. Okay? They're not... No way. Absolutely not. They're not going to be interested in that. So there's a lot of things in here that increase the cost of doing business in the UK. You know, needing all of these medical doctors and changing the nature of what a training facility like the Performance Center is, a training facility that they built in Europe. So people were saying like, oh, they didn't build any infrastructure here. Like they built a Performance Center just for NXT UK. And now it's sitting over there, I guess, abandoned. I don't know if they're using it or not and what they're using it for, if they are using it. But most people did not do any research on this. I knew about this when they were doing it because it was a big thing following speaking out that the government was going to get involved. And they did. Now, if you try to look up the guidance, the paper, it was a 300-page paper or something. It was released at the time. And it's hard to find now. I even looked on a Wayback Machine and couldn't find it. But thankfully, Alex Davies Jones left it on her website. So there it is. This is why NXT Europe has not happened yet. You know, it's not that WWE, it's not just that WWE is in the hands of a different owner. It's not just that, you know, they've already poached the top talent from European scene, like, you know, Pete Dunne and Gunther and those kinds of guys. It's not just that. It's not just that they decided to cut off a lot of the British indies that they were working with, like Progress and WXW and ICW. It's not just that. It's also that the British government got involved and started making all these recommendations that are going to change the nature of the business over in Europe. Now, as far as I know right now, nothing has changed. Now, in terms of talent pay, which is always going to be a discussion because people think that wrestlers should be paid like movie stars when they're not movie stars. The one person that I remember complaining about the way that they were paid was Killer Kelly. And Killer Kelly left NXT UK because she didn't like the pay scale. And she felt since she was working for WWE, she should have made more money. Well, she's an OnlyFans girl right now who barely wrestles anymore. But I like Killer Kelly. I've always liked Killer Kelly. It's just that she was the one person who was complaining about how much money she was making. Most other people saw it as a foot in the door, and which is how you look at going to NXT. You know, NXT isn't main roster WWE. You're not being asked to do a hell of a lot, especially when you consider if they were making $25,000 a year. Let's say that they were only working 1 day a week, 1 or 2 days an entire week, and they weren't really touring that much. Even before the closing of NXT UK, they weren't touring that much. And if $25,000 was their basic guarantee, well, we don't know what they could have made in merchandise sales, et cetera, et cetera. But everything changed during the pandemic. Not only was there a worldwide pandemic, which cost WWE tremendous amounts of money, and they had to downsize, which is they had to start cutting talent, which a lot of whom were NXT UK talent because they were cutting talent all over the place. They cut a bunch of talent in NXT too. NXT and the main roster. That's how you ended up with Aleister Black over in AEW and Andrade over in AEW, is because they were cutting talent left and right due to the worldwide pandemic, and they were trying not to lose money. And then you had the speaking out situation, which led to a lot of the NXT UK wrestlers being exposed as being predators and weirdos, which includes like Jack Gallagher and a couple of other guys. But then they took the guys that they really wanted from NXT Europe, like I already said, like Gunther, Tyler Bate, Pete Dunne. They brought them over to the United States. And then fourth, the government got involved because, like I just mentioned, you know, Alex Davies Jones and her group started investigating and suggesting all sorts of minimum standards, which I'm pretty sure WWE was already providing. But then you also had the creation of a union and a bunch of other stuff that they're suggesting. And they're like, no way, forget about it. And then the fifth thing is most of these companies are still around. They're still there, you know? So it didn't, quote, kill the scene, because you can't kill the scene. These companies still exist. So there's a lot happening here that is worth talking about and looking into. And you would think that somebody like Dave Meltzer, if you are even remotely honest, would have mentioned in his, well, I'm hearing they're doing this thing, but now they're not doing it. It's like, well, the government investigated 2 years ago or something like that. So if they're going to do it, they're going to have to figure out how to make it work with these new guidelines and these new demands, or if any new laws are going to pop, which is a question. Like, how can you create something in a landscape that's changing all the time? If they decided to change the law in the United States, something would have to change, you know? So I don't know for sure if any laws have changed around pro wrestling in Europe. Well, it's in the UK especially. If it has, that would explain why there hasn't been an NXT UK Europe and why it's not likely to. But the overall big issue is that the company was sold since then. So if Endeavor doesn't see a reason to have a performance center in England or in Europe somewhere to recruit European talent, then they'll just close it down and they'll break it down and that'll be the end of it. But nobody's asked Triple H about this, which is definitely one of the business questions that you could ask Triple H about or ask Shawn Michaels about. But who has asked them about this? Nobody. The last time somebody asked Shawn Michaels about this NXT Europe was in October of 23. And that was the last time somebody asked him about NXT Europe. And this was his response. He says, on NXT Europe, I'm obviously looking forward to that, but from my standpoint, I'm still waiting to find out. That's what he said. Obviously, I think we're all very excited that at least for now, we can start getting that underway and hopefully, again, bringing it to everybody. I think Triple H mentioned it in 2024, but right now, I'm a soldier that's just waiting on marching orders, but I'm definitely ready to go. So this was in October of 2023. So Dave Meltzer puts out this statement in August of 2024, but nobody has asked a question about NXT UK, NXT Europe in almost a year. Nobody has asked about this thing in almost a year. And in 2022, Shawn basically said it was going to happen, but I'm pretty sure this was shortly after the company was sold, and they didn't know what Endeavor was going to do yet. So right now, we have no idea whether it's going to happen or not, but a lot of things have changed since the initial idea was launched. So we'll see. But I just wanted to give a fuller view of NXT Europe than what you would get from Dave Meltzer. So let me know what you guys think. Again, I loved No Mercy. I thought it was a really good show. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you guys later.